Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our CISQ webinar this morning. Very shortly, I'm going to pass over to Bill Curtis, the Director of CISQ. But really quickly, before we get started, if you have any questions during the webinar, we urge you to send them into the question box. We'll be having a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Additionally, if you have any logistical questions, you can send them in there as well, and I will be checking that throughout the webinar. So let's go ahead and get started. Bill, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming this morning. We're going to have an expert seminar this morning sponsored by CISQ with Chris Dressler, who's the Vice President of Architecture and Technology at Cablevision. Chris, however, speaking really as an expert in the field of software architecture and the risk of large architectural issues in large IT installations. I want to give you a few short words on CISQ first, let you know what CISQ is. Becky, can you move to the next slide? CISQ was formed by the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon and Object Management Group several years ago to help address the need for automated measures in software development. We had 24 companies join CISQ when we started this. You can see there the names of the 24 original members, a very wide selection of large IT organizations, system engineering organizations, outsourcers, and small companies that support the IT space. They got together, provided technical expertise into building these measures. If you go to the next slide, Becky. And these were the measures that the executives of these companies, the IT executives, asked us to take on. First, an automated specification for function points, which has been now approved by OMG as a supported specification. We'll see within the next 2 quarters, we'll see technology in the market that complies with OMG's specification for automated function points. We're in the process now of going through developing an OMG standard for reliability, performance, efficiency, security, and maintainability, and expect to have those out by the end of the year. These become OMG-supported specifications. There's a fast track for OMG over to ISO, and we'll be providing deployment workshops to help people learn about the specifications and get more information on how to use them, how to incorporate them into their improvement programs, into their outsourcing contracts, into their benchmarking and estimating capabilities, and into their quality management procedures. Becky, can we go to the next slide? These are the seminars we'll be holding with CISQ to help deploy these measures at the OMG meetings in Reston next week, March 20th, next Wednesday. Anyone in the D.C. area, we'd love to have you come. Also at other OMG meetings later in the year at Berlin, in New Brunswick, New Jersey, near New York, and in Santa Clara in the Bay Area. This the content. You can see we'll be talking about productivity analysis and how to use automated function points for benchmarking, productivity improvement, and estimating. And in the afternoon, we'll be talking about measuring and managing structural quality. So we hope to see people in each of these areas come and learn more about how to use these automated measures in managing quality and productivity. So I want to turn now to the topic for today, managing software risk, and the ideas and experiences that Chris Dressler has had in his career in managing software architecture and trying to manage risk and doing that most recently at Cablevision. So Chris, let me turn it over to you, and you can continue on with today's seminar.
Thank you, Bill. Can everybody see my screen? We just transferred control. So the topic today, we're going to talk about managing software risk. Me specifically, I'm interested in how architecture can help drive that managing of software risk. Before we get going, a little bit about myself. So I'm Vice President Technology Architecture here at Cablevision. I've been working here just under 5 years, and it's still an interesting time. My experience in the background, right? I started out literally writing software. I'm not sure how familiar are you with SNMP. But I was integrating SNMP into routers, switches, all kinds of stuff way back. So it started out in engineering, some software engineering. I started moving and doing software development. I've worked in IT infrastructure environments, and I have a lot of experience with enterprise and application architecture. So like I said before, I've wrote software at the hardware level. I also write just applications. I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of the work that was done, but email publishing systems. So these are high-volume email publishing environments, capable of pushing out billions of messages and within days. And e-commerce environments, manufacturing environments, and now I've been spending a lot of time in OSS, BSS environments, which is billing and operational support systems. I think that is a topic we'll talk about a little bit in a few minutes. The industries I primarily focused on: media and publishing, financial and cable. And the cable industries makes sense. I'm here in New York, so that means that there's a lot of media publishing and financial industries up here. And currently, I'm embarking on somewhat of a different direction. I've taken over responsibility for enterprise data management here, so I want to start looking more in depth at how data can drive a lot of our engineering decisions that are being made, and so that's kind of an interesting topic for me now as well. I also thought you might be interested to know that I am a member of the New York CTO Club. It's a CTO club founded here in New York in about 13 years ago. The purpose of the group is really to help members succeed professionally through education, candid exchange of information about things that we work on or do in our daily lives. We meet for breakfast and drinks, about once a month, and we maintain a private email list. In fact, we just met yesterday, yesterday. It's an independent group, so it's a nonprofit, an invitation only to senior technologists. It is vendor and press are generally not permitted unless they're been asked to present, and the content and talks of the comments of the attendees are all off the record. So it's always a very interesting place to have some interesting exchanges. And this is where I take an opportunity to do research. I also do take an opportunity to help people, learn about what's going on. So if there's organizations like that around you, wherever you're located, by all means do so. We've actually expanded into Boston, Connecticut, New Jersey, and here on Long Island. There's not as many of us out on Long Island, but there's still a number of us here as well. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out and let me know. So I guess one of the things that's interesting for me, and it really ties back into measuring software, is how do you measure the impact of architecture on software, especially when it comes to software quality. So my thoughts are, my opinion is that good architecture is needed to enable scalability. It's necessary to ensure security, simplify complexity, all kinds of things of this nature, right? It really helps control that SDLC, and it helps you manage the evolving architecture as well. So a lot of the things that I think are important there is that, when we talk about scalability, it's not just, can you get bigger? You need to ask some fundamental questions about why you're scaling and there's different kinds of scaling, capacity or breadth, right? Rather doing one thing really, really fast, 4 billion email messages a day, or do you need to send 4 billion types of emails every day, which is a very different type of capacity issue. When you talk about security, are we talking about data security, application security? We'll go into a little bit more detail later. And when we talk about simplicity or simplifying the complexity, how do you really, without losing the appropriate detail, how do you distill that detail? And then for me, I think it's important to provide vision in this environment, but to keep it from becoming academic, you also want to provide specific objectives. So I think if we look at this, so how do you measure, or can you measure the impact of software, this architecture on software development? So the first question that really comes to mind is, what should you measure, and what do you define as quality? So if you think of it, the classic measures are, the size of the code, so how many lines of code, the numbers of code, modules, etc. Numbers of defects. I like to think of defect resolution time, so you start getting away from the code. So I think good architecture can be measured in the speed with which you can actually start to resolve these different defects that are found ultimately. I think the number of features, right? So are you constantly needing to add new features, or did you architect these in the beginning? Is there an appropriate amount of documentation available? And long, what every business is really interested in ultimately, what's the cost of that, of the software? So I think this is kind of how you would measure it, and how do you save money? And more importantly, how do you automate, if you can, any of this stuff? So it's interesting, as we tie back, we'll have to start integrating into this these automated function points into the measuring architecture. So just as a side note there, there's some interest. There's a gentleman by the name of Rick Kasman. There's a lot of interesting discussions that he has, and it's also through SEI, which is the Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute, actually. And they've got a lot of interesting papers that they put out as well, and I read lots of them. So to kind of do this, if we want to measure the architecture, the first thing I do whenever I look at a new project is I perform what I call an architecture review. And that architecture review means that I'm going to go through and I'm going to start to measure it. I'm going to get a lay of the land, what I like to call a lay of the land. I do this for new initiatives or when there's a major refactoring exercise. I think that whenever you're doing a large refactoring exercise, it's an opportunity to make things better. So I think we do this, right? And I think you should do this. I also, the way that I tend to do this is I make sure that it's not this ad hoc process that everybody goes through. So I make sure that I put together as many templates as possible. So it's a process-driven, it's also template-driven. So people know coming into it what are the types of things that they're going to be asked, what are we going to be looking for. In fact, they get the template beforehand and they can start to review it. So when I get a lay of the land, I measure what I like to call the speeds and feeds, or feeds and speeds, and of the system that I'm looking at. And so that includes things like messaging performance. So if we want to look at message performance, we want to look at speed to accomplish a particular task. We want to look at capacity of the system, number of types of errors that we need to deal with, system availability. So this is really need to be a high availability system. Doesn't need to be geographically redundant, diversified. So do we want flexible systems? So this is really to think about when we talk about flexibility. What type of changes are we going to make to the system going forward? So are we going to make functional changes, platform changes, hardware changes? Do we plan on moving it later on to a different operating system? Do we plan on changing protocols that it's going to need to deal with? So flexibility of the system is very important, and a lot of folks, I think, we need to look at that and understand it better. Security is becoming more and more of an issue, and actually that's, especially in any industry, I think that today you're going to see a lot of security being brought into any development activity, and especially driven by these articles that have been recently released where certain organizations are being identified as targeting the United States and its infrastructure. So when it comes to security, I think that what we want to think about or things to consider is confidentiality. So is the information, basically, how do you make sure that you're authorized to release whatever you are that you're releasing? You want to make sure that there's integrity of the data. So the data and the services are delivered unmodified or as you intended them to be delivered. So non-repudiation. We want to make sure that the participants that are in the role or that you're dealing with are really who they are, and they're not someone trying to fake you out. So you want to make sure that they're authenticated as well, and you want to have some ability to audit and go back through and see what was actually happening. So that tends to be how you find your issues. And then I think something that's funny enough is what a lot of people forget about is ultimately through these architecture reviews, are there specific objectives that you're looking to accomplish as a result of it? Sometimes we'll go in there and we want to add availability. That tends to be the focus of it, meaning higher availability, and there's a lot of ways of accomplishing that. So you don't want to focus on issues or bugs if well, you need to always focus on bugs, but you want to make sure you're doing the right thing for availability when that's the objective. So this process, by the way, this is kind of an aside, this process in and of itself, I think, should be measured. So architecture reviews, you should take a look at them, and if it's valuable, then it's worth measuring, and it's valuable to do these architecture reviews. So you want to understand what should be reviewed, how often are they reviewed, numbers of reviews. You want to make sure that if you're focused on a particular area, I see that sometimes organizations will focus on doing architecture reviews or rewrite the software only in a customer-facing environment, but the back end tends to be the problem. You also want to see what types of recommendations are coming out of this and how effective those recommendations are. So I think by doing that and by gathering that information, you can find out and improve this overall architecture review process. So again, this is where measuring it really, I think, is an important part of it. So if we think about some of the benefits of an architecture review, and again, where do you measure some of these benefits? So I think that it's very important to think about, you're having fewer and less impactful software bugs. So this really contributes to higher availability. I think that really a major benefit is that if you have fewer bugs, that's great. But what I have seen in the past is you only have 2 bugs, but those 2 bugs, brought down the entire system and left a lot of customers without service or without the service that they were looking for. So I think that's that less impactful part of it is a very important aspect of it. So I think you're also, by doing this, you're getting a faster turnaround of the projects that you're working on, and that's a very measurable aspect. Ultimately, one of the first things that I usually look at is I look at the number of projects that that we're able to accomplish in a given year, especially the software development projects and the turnaround. And if you're doing 5 projects a year, major projects, you should be able to, if you do it properly, and well, it depends on how effective the organization is, we've been able to double literally the number of projects that we're able to do in a year in some of the places that I've worked. So that alone gives you a significant increase in what you're able to get done and cost associated with it. I think another aspect of it is that by doing this, you're going to drive less complexity. Systems are complex enough without adding unnecessary complexity. And I think by going through and forcing individuals to measure what they're doing, by understanding what your objectives are, you can actually drive a lot less complexity in the overall infrastructure and software. This, in the end, improves the overall ROI. Although I always talk about top line and bottom line, this is a purely bottom line savings. So you're saving costs on manpower, on tools, on servers, on systems of that nature. So it's really not a top line revenue increase, or it's more of a cost saving effort. So if I think about who's going to benefit from this, for me, it's always about the user or customer. And I think if you lose sight of that in the end, if you're making changes that aren't benefiting the users or customers, there's kind of a Darwinian effect here, is that whatever you're doing is going to be out-competed by someone else. So, but the indirect benefactors are also very important, and in this case, the implementers of the environment are going to benefit by understanding, all of this information that we're gathering related to the project. The engineers are going to be able to build systems better, design systems better. The developer is going to be able to, write the software quicker. That's going to be more clear what needs to get done. Systems administrators, the DBAs, everybody who's actually implementing that project, they're going to be able to get their project, that work done more quickly without having lots of meetings and by simply doing what they need to do. I think another indirect benefactor is the QA organization, and that not just from the back-end testing environment, but also from the user, the UAT testing as well, or the user acceptance testing. Everybody is more they both understand what you're trying to get out of it. Were you trying to get faster performance? Were you trying to get faster or better throughput? Ultimately, you're going to be able to specifically test those things that you're looking for, and you're going to spend less time looking or thinking about what you have to test. And then ultimately, managers and project managers are going to benefit from this as well, because they are now, they're able to manage the organization. They're able to get more transparency into what's going on. From a manager perspective, the project managers know and are able to very clearly indicate what are the tasks necessary. By the way, this is as appropriate if you're using a waterfall methodology as when you're using an agile methodology. And I would say even more so if you're using agile as your development methodology. So I guess ultimately the question that always comes up is, well, do I always succeed in accomplishing all of these benefits? And the reality of it is that no, you don't always receive or succeed in getting all of these benefits. You'll get some of the benefits, and you try to get as many of these benefits, and more importantly, not just you don't want to just make the customer a little bit happy. You want to overwhelm them, but ultimately, I've seen varying degrees of success as a result of measuring and enforcing architecture. But I honestly, in this position, I think that the biggest indicator of success for any of these projects is really ultimately about the people that are working on the project and the passion that they have for it. And that kind of leads me into the next part of it, which I don't know that you can necessarily measure, but really what I rely on to do this, especially when dealing with an agile environment, is what I like to call a developer architect. And this is kind of an aside. I don't know that you can measure anything about the developer, or developer architecture, but this is who I rely on a lot. So who can help me do this or accomplish all of these tasks is the developer architect. And there's an interesting conversation in the architect community is, can a developer be an architect? Developers tend to be focused on literally what's the tactical issue, how do I move this packet of data from my application through an adapter onto the messaging bus. So it's a very focused effort, whereas the architects tend to be more focused on what type of a messaging bus do I want to use, or what type of an adapter should I be building, and looking at the overall system and its complexity. And my contention is that ultimately you're going to need a mixture of classic architects that are looking at the very big picture and a very long runway, meaning 5 years out. But you really need to start, if you haven't already started cultivating what I call these developer architects. And this is essentially a developer who started out as an individual started out as a developer who I've basically taken out of the architecture group and started training and cultivating into an architect. So they tend to be the best ones. They come from the development organization, and they can really help you be very successful in accomplishing a lot of those goals. Interestingly enough, as in the end, it lends itself particularly well to the agile development or agile world, in that you've got, in that world, you have folks that are playing multiple roles, and in this role, you'd have someone playing multiple roles as well. So it speeds up that process and allows us to work with various organizations. So as in any company, you have different divisions. Some will work with, some of these divisions will implement something like Agile. Some will implement more traditional methodologies, and you need to be able to deal with both. And this is how I accomplish that. So I also, again, as kind of a tangent, the question was asked of what kind of, if we look at custom software development, where do I see a lot of custom software development being done? And just as a matter of, because of what I'm doing right now, I think, in any ecosystem that would include OSS or BSS environments. So if you're not familiar with these, it's been operational support systems and billing support systems, and these systems tend to be focused on telecoms, on different carriers, cable industry, and they're used by all of them. They ultimately need to have it not just in these industries, but in others as well. But anytime you see this, you're going to see a lot of customization, and when I say I mean tons. So these software packages are really from vendors like Oracle, Amdocs, Netcracker, Axiom, Convergys. The list goes on. There's a lot of them, but these are, I think, the major players in that environment. So that helps you understand who's really doing that. And really, the customization comes from the integration of the customer-facing systems, such as components, right? Such as the network components, phone systems, switches, etc. The analogy or the example here being in a cellular environment. If you go to the store, you pick up your Nokia phone, and you want to have that using the network from Sprint or something of that nature, they need to make that. They need to provision that cell phone onto its network, meaning enable it to function, give it the permissions, give it all of the access that it needs to make the phone calls, and then also make sure everybody's aware of how to make phone calls to you. So distribute your phone number and deal with a lot of the infrastructure. The other side of that is the integration of all of these systems into the back end side. So you have your billing, your ADR, which is the automated voice response systems, your field support infrastructure, your customer support infrastructure. There's just a lot of software customizations that need to be done to do that. The integration process, I'd say, in fact, the cost of that OSS BSS is probably half, if not less, of the overall cost of doing it. The integration is probably more. But again, that's I'd have to sit down and look at the exact details on all of it. Something that also is interesting is that the older systems tend not to be able to deal with the new components. So your old OSS BSS environments don't know how to deal with voice over IP, as an example, if you look at the old cell systems. So they end up having to essentially externalize that from it, which is a complete customization. So that's a very interesting area to look at. Something that I hadn't mentioned is in all of these areas, regulation also plays a big part. So whenever you're looking at the customization in here, certain federal or regulatory agreements, they ultimately play here and have to be taken into consideration as well. And so that means that there's a lot of integration with external systems, external providers, and external organizations.